In the autumn of 1943, the American daylight bombing campaign over Germany was dying, and everyone at 8th Air Force headquarters in England knew it, even if almost nobody would say it out loud. The 8th had gone back to Schweinfurt on October 14th and lost 60 of 291 bombers in a single afternoon, roughly 600 men, in a raid that has been remembered ever since as Black Thursday. After that, the 8th simply stopped sending its bombers deep into Germany. It could not afford to. The theory that had built the entire American strategic bombing campaign, the theory that a formation of heavily armed bombers flying in tight defensive boxes could fight its way to any target in Germany without a fighter escort, had just been tested against the best air defense system on Earth. And it had failed. 8 months later, in June of 1944, those same bombers crossed into Germany in broad daylight, flew straight over Berlin, and came home having lost almost nothing. American fighters were not clustered around the bomber formations anymore. They were ranging 50 miles ahead, hunting for the Luftwaffe, strafing German airfields on the way home, shooting German fighters out of the sky faster than German flight schools could train replacements. It was the same Air Force. Many of the same crews, or what was left of them, were still flying the same B-17s and B-24s. The airplanes had not fundamentally changed. What changed was one decision, made by one general, about what the fighters were allowed to do. The man who made that decision called it, in his own memoir years later, the most important and far-reaching military decision he made during the entire war. He also called it the most controversial. His name was Jimmy Doolittle, and this is the story of how one order broke a doctrine that men far more senior than he was had spent a decade building, defending, and refusing to admit was wrong. To understand how far the 8th Air Force had fallen by the fall of 1943, you have to go back to a peacetime classroom at the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field in Alabama, where a small circle of instructors had spent the 1930s building the theory that would eventually get thousands of American airmen killed. The men history now calls the Bomber Mafia were not villains. They were true believers. Harold George, Haywood Hansel, Kenneth Walker, Lawrence Cuter, Donald Wilson, and a handful of others had convinced themselves, and then convinced the entire American air establishment, of something called the industrial web theory. The idea was elegant. Find the small number of critical nodes in an industrial economy, the ball-bearing plants, the oil refineries, the aircraft factories, and destroy them with precision daylight bombing and the enemy's ability to fight collapses. 4 of these same instructors went on to write the actual war plans, the documents that shaped how the Army Air Forces built itself for the war that was coming. The part of the theory that should have been the obvious weak point was the assumption that the bombers did not need a long-range fighter escort to get there and back. The Bomber Mafia's argument was that a fast, high-flying, heavily armed bomber formation, the B-17 especially, could defend itself. Put enough machine guns in a tight combat box formation, the thinking went, and the overlapping fields of fire would make the formation nearly invulnerable to fighter attack. The combat box itself was a genuinely clever piece of tactical engineering. Squadrons of bombers, stacked at different altitudes and offset laterally so that every aircraft's guns could cover its neighbors, turning a formation of individually vulnerable airplanes into something closer to a single flying fortress, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns in every direction. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, German fighter pilots simply learned to attack from directly ahead, head-on, closing at a combined speed of nearly 500 miles an hour, an angle from which the B-17's early defensive armament was weakest, and a bomber crew had less than 2 seconds to react. In 1933, tests at March Field appeared to confirm the broader theory. Fighters could barely catch the new generation of fast bombers. A young Air Corps officer, a fighter tactics instructor named Claire Chennault, argued forcefully that this was wrong, that fighters would catch up as engine technology improved, and that bombers would need an escort that could go the distance, no matter how good the formation's own guns were. He was overruled, and the story of what happened to Chennault afterward, forced out of the Air Corps and eventually vindicated commanding the Flying Tigers in China, is a video of its own on this channel. But it is worth remembering here that the warning existed. It was made by name on the record years before the war started. The Air Corps heard it and built the Doctrine anyway. When the Air Corps was offered proposals for auxiliary drop tanks in 1939 and again in 1941, the answer both times was no. The tanks would add weight for no good purpose, the reasoning went, because the bombers were not supposed to need the help. By the time the Doctrine's own author, Haywood Hansel, looked back on it years later, even he had to admit what the theory had missed. He wrote that no one could quite conceive how a small fighter could have the range of the bomber and still keep the maneuverability to fight. That admission came after the fact. In 1942, when the 8th Air Force's official field manual described the mission of its escort fighters, it stated plainly that their job precluded them from seeking combat with other forces, except as necessary to carry out their defensive role. In other words, stay close to the bombers, and do not go looking for a fight. The man tasked with running that doctrine in combat was Lieutenant General Ira Eaker, who took command of the 8th Air Force in December of 1942. Eaker was a fighter pilot by background, but as commander of the Strategic Bomber Force, he strictly followed the doctrine he had inherited. In October of 1942, he told his superiors that a large force of day bombers could operate almost anywhere in Germany without excessive losses, and that the B-17 could handle the German day fighter if flown in close formation. The math told a different story almost immediately, and it kept telling that story louder and louder through 1943. Between July and November of that year, the 8th Air Force lost 64% of its aircrew. 64%. That is not a statistic you absorb casually, and I do not think it can be absorbed casually. That is a bomber crew of 10 men, where, on average, more than 6 of them would not survive their tour. The first Schweinfurt raid in August of 1943 cost 60 bombers. The Air Corps sent the crews back to the same target 2 months later in October, and lost 60 more, along with roughly 600 men killed, captured, or missing in a single afternoon. As Tammy Davis Biddle argues in her book Rhetoric and Reality in Air Warfare, the gap between what the bomber mafia had promised in the 1930s and what actually happened over Germany in 1943 was not a small miscalculation. It was the entire foundation of American air doctrine meeting reality and losing. And here is the part I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. The men who built that doctrine were not stupid, and they were not indifferent to the losses. They were true believers defending an idea past the point where the evidence had already condemned it, and that is a much more dangerous failure than simple incompetence, because true believers do not need to be lied to. They lie to themselves. If you're finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. Now, back to the collapse of the 8th Air Force, and the general who was about to be replaced because of it. By the time Black Thursday was over, the official Army Air Force's history, written after the war by Craven and Cate, concluded flatly that the 8th Air Force had, for the time being, lost air superiority over Germany. That sentence, from the government's own historians, is about as damning as institutional prose gets. The 8th stood down from deep penetration missions into Germany for weeks. On the airfields of East Anglia that autumn, ground crews counted empty bunks and barracks that had held 10 men to a hut, and squadron adjutants worked through stacks of letters home that had to be written whether or not there was any good way to write them. Barrett Tillman and other historians of the period have noted that some bomb groups lost effectively their entire original complement of crews within their first 4 months of combat, meaning the men who had trained together, flown the Atlantic together, and moved into England together as a unit were, by the fall of 1943, almost entirely gone. Command in Washington understood that something structural had to change, and that change was already coming from a completely different direction. In December of 1943, Dwight Eisenhower was named Supreme Allied Commander for the invasion of France, and he brought his Mediterranean command team north with him. Carl Spaatz took over a new organization called the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, and the command of the 8th Air Force itself went to a man who, on paper, seemed like an odd fit for a strategic bombing command. His name was Jimmy Doolittle, and he was best known to the American public as the man who had led the Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April of 1942, a bombing mission so audacious it had been planned as much for morale as for military effect. The General Doolittle was replacing did not go quietly, at least not in his own mind. Ira Eaker cabled his superiors that he believed the war's interests would best be served by his own retention in command of the 8th Air Force. He called it heartbreaking to be moved out just before what he believed would be the climax of the bomber offensive he had built. His biographer, James Parton, described the transition as the most painful of Eaker's career. Technically, Eaker was promoted. He was given command of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, a larger combined command covering the 12th and 15th Air Forces along with British air units. But everyone involved understood what it actually was. The main event, the strategic bombing campaign against Germany, was staying in England, and Eaker was not. I think it is worth being honest about what this looked like from the outside, because it fits a pattern this channel keeps returning to. The commander who had built and defended the existing Doctrine, who had shackled his own fighters to the bombers because that was what the Doctrine required, was moved sideways at the exact moment the Doctrine needed to be broken. Whether that was intentional or simply the accident of Eisenhower bringing his own team north, the effect was the same. The 8th Air Force needed a commander with no personal investment in defending the old way of doing things. It got one. Doolittle assumed command of the 8th Air Force on January 6, 1944, at the headquarters in High Wycombe, England. He inherited a force that had nearly broken itself against Schweinfurt, a doctrine that had just failed catastrophically, and crucially, resources that Eaker had never had. In December of 1943, Eaker's fighter strength stood at roughly 380 P-38s and 266 P-51s. By the time Doolittle took over the following month, that had grown to roughly 637 P-38s and 543 P-51s. The airplane that would ultimately win the argument for him was already flooding into England. It just had not yet been unleashed. Doolittle was not operating alone, and it would be dishonest to tell this story as though one man simply woke up one morning and decided to change the doctrine. General Hap Arnold, running the Army Air Forces from Washington, had sent instructions before Doolittle even took command that made the priority unmistakable: destroy the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground before the invasion of France, whatever it took. Karl Spaatz, running the larger Strategic Air Command above Doolittle, had his own version of the same idea, one that historians now describe as bombers as bait. Send the heavy bombers deep into Germany against targets the Luftwaffe could not afford to ignore. Force German fighters up to defend them, and let the newly capable American fighters wear the Luftwaffe down in the air battles that followed. The bombing itself, in Spaatz's framing, was almost secondary to the attrition it produced. Doolittle's order to release the fighters was the piece that made that entire strategy actually work in practice, but it sat inside a larger plan that both his superiors were already building. I think that context matters because it changes the shape of the story without changing its conclusion. Doolittle still made the call, put his name on it, and absorbed the resentment from crews and traditionalists alike. He just was not inventing the whole strategy from nothing. And a channel built on getting the details right owes you that nuance. Within his first weeks in command, Doolittle went to visit Major General William Kepner, who commanded the 8th Air Force's fighter units. On the wall of Kepner's headquarters was a sign, one that had been there before Doolittle arrived, that read something to the effect of, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." Doolittle looked at it and told Kepner to take it down. He said it was wrong. In its place went a new sign, reading that the first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters was to destroy German fighters. I want to be straight with you about this story because your channel's audience has earned that honesty. The sign anecdote is well attested. It comes from Doolittle's own memoir, I Could Never Be So Lucky Again, published in 1991, and it is repeated by serious historians, including John Carrell in his account of the decision in Air and Space Forces magazine. But no photograph of the actual sign has ever surfaced, and there's good evidence that the idea of releasing fighters from close escort duty was already being discussed, and in at least one case already being flown before Doolittle's arrival. On December 20th, 1943, weeks before Doolittle took command, the 55th Fighter Group flew what was described in unit histories as a freelance mission, ranging ahead of the bomber stream on its own initiative. It was already a plan much discussed among fighter pilots at 8th Fighter Command. So the fair way to tell this story, the way I think an honest historian tells it, is that Doolittle did not invent the idea out of nothing. What he did was take an idea that was already circulating among the men flying the missions, formalize it as official policy, order it implemented across the entire fighter force, and put his own name and rank behind a decision that senior officers loyal to the old doctrine were guaranteed to resent. That is still an act of real leadership. Taking credit for other people's good idea is common. Taking responsibility for other people's risky idea in writing, with your career attached to it, is not. The command structure itself was reshuffled to match the new strategy. On February 22nd, 1944, in the middle of Big Week, the old headquarters known as 8th Bomber Command was formally redesignated the 8th Air Force, with Doolittle in direct command of it, while the larger organization above him, now called the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe under Karl Spaatz, coordinated the 8th and the 15th Air Forces together against the same German targets. It was a bureaucratic change on paper, but it mattered in practice because it put Doolittle in direct, unambiguous control of both the bombers and the fighters that had to work together for the new strategy to succeed. Under the old arrangement, that kind of authority had been split across multiple headquarters, which had made it easier for a doctrine as entrenched as unescorted daylight bombing to survive challenge for as long as it did. Nobody with the authority to change it also had the full picture of why it needed to change. Doolittle, by February of 1944, had both. As far as he was concerned, this was the most important and far-reaching military decision he made during the entire war. It was also, in his own words, the most controversial. And it was controversial in exactly the direction you would expect. The doctrine that had governed American fighter operations for 2 years had been built on the premise that the fighters existed to protect the bombers, full stop. Releasing them to hunt meant admitting implicitly that the entire theory the bomber mafia had spent a decade building, the theory that bombers did not fundamentally need fighters at all, had been wrong from the start. This is where I think the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable for the institution, because Doolittle's order was not a tactical adjustment. It was an indictment of everything the Air Corps Tactical School had taught for a decade, delivered by a man who had never been part of that faculty and owed it nothing. The change did not sit well with everyone, and it did not sit well immediately with the men it was supposed to protect. Bomber crews, watching their fighter escort peel away and disappear over the horizon instead of staying tucked in close, were dismayed. They had spent a year and a half being told that the fighters existed to bring them home, and now the fighters were leaving to go looking for a fight somewhere else. It got worse before it got better, because German fighter controllers quickly learned to use decoy aircraft to pull American fighters even further from the bomber stream, occasionally leaving formations exposed at exactly the moment they needed protection. And Doolittle did not make himself any more popular by raising the length of a combat tour from 25 missions to 30, and later to 35. At almost the same moment, losses were still climbing. Warfare history. Network's own summary of the period puts it bluntly. Doolittle was far from loved by the bomber crews in those early weeks. I think that resentment is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something about how doctrine actually dies inside a large institution. It does not die because everyone suddenly agrees the old way was wrong. It dies because someone with enough rank forces the change through, while plenty of people, including the men most directly affected by it, are still convinced the old way was safer. Here is where the decision becomes indefensible if it had failed, and here is why it did not. The airplane that made the new policy possible was the North American P-51B Mustang, fitted with a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and it had arrived in England in exactly the right numbers at exactly the right moment. Before the Merlin-engined Mustang, but the 8th Air Force's escort fighters simply could not go the distance. A P-47. Thunderbolt with 2 drop tanks had a combat radius of roughly 350 miles, enough to reach targets like Bremen, but nowhere close to Berlin. The P-51B changed that overnight. As Air and Space Forces magazine put it, the escort radius jumped from 320 miles to 650 miles literally overnight with the new fighter. And with a pair of 108-gallon drop tanks added, the escort radius fanned out to somewhere between 750 and 850 miles. That was the difference between escorting bombers to the German border and escorting them all the way to Berlin and back. The 57th Fighter Group became the first 8th Air Force unit to fly Mustangs into combat, flying its first mission on February 11, 1944, and scoring its first aerial victory 9 days later. The famous 4th Fighter Group, commanded by Colonel Don Blakesley, received its Mustangs on February 28th, and 4 days later, on March 4th, Blakesley's pilots were escorting bombers to Berlin, some of them, according to squadron lore, learning to fly the unfamiliar P-51 on the way to the target. Through the spring, group after group converted, the 352nd, the 355th, the 359th, until by D-Day, the 8th Air Force had 9 full fighter groups flying Mustangs, and by the end of 1944, 14 of the 8th's 15 fighter groups had converted, with only the 56th Fighter Group staying loyal to its P-47s. The combination of Doolittle's new order and the P-51's range produced the operation that historians now treat as the true turning point of the air war over Europe. A 5-day campaign in late February of 1944 that the 8th Air Force called Operation Argument, and that has gone down in history simply as Big Week. From February 20th to the 25th, the 8th Air Force flew roughly 3,300 heavy bomber sorties. The 15th Air Force in Italy added roughly 500 more. And together, they dropped close to 10,000 tons of bombs on more than a dozen German aircraft industry targets, including major aircraft assembly plants at Leipzig, Brunswick, Regensburg, and Augsburg, the same Regensburg complex the 8th had already bloodied itself against back in August of 1943. The operation had actually been delayed for weeks, waiting on clear weather over the continent. And when 8th Air Force meteorologists finally forecast a break in the cloud cover, the mission was launched on almost no notice. On the very first day, the 8th put up more than 1,000 bombers, its first ever 1,000-bomber mission, escorted by 835 fighters. Commanders had privately feared they might lose 200 bombers that day alone. They lost 21. Over the full 5 days, the 8th lost 97 B-17s and 40 B-24s, with roughly 20 more written off as damaged beyond repair, and lost 28 fighters. That is a real toll, and I want to be honest about it rather than pretend Big Week was painless. But set against the losses at Schweinfurt just 4 months earlier, where a single mission had cost 20% of the attacking force, Big Week's overall loss rate came in under 7%. The doctrine had changed, and the arithmetic of survival had changed with it. For the Luftwaffe, Big Week was catastrophic in a way that went far beyond the airplanes it lost that week. German fighter losses for the operation ran to somewhere between 262 and 355 aircraft, and roughly 100 German pilots killed. The National Museum of the United States Air Force states it plainly. The Germans lost over 1/3 of their single-engine fighters that week, but even more devastating to the Luftwaffe was the loss of 18% of its experienced fighter pilots. That distinction between airplanes and pilots is the one I think matters most in this entire story, and it is the one that gets skipped in most documentaries that focus only on bomb tonnage. There is a nuance here that the documentaries tend to skip entirely, and I think it is actually the most important technical point in the whole story. Big Week did not cripple German aircraft production the way American planners had hoped it would. Albert Speer's armaments ministry dispersed fighter production into smaller, harder-to-target facilities, and German fighter output actually kept climbing through the year, eventually peaking at over 4,100 aircraft built in September of 1944 alone, months after Big Week and months after D-Day. If you judged the campaign purely by factory output, you could argue it barely worked at all, but airplanes without trained pilots are just targets sitting on a runway. And that is exactly what a growing share of the Luftwaffe's new fighters became. Germany could rebuild its factories faster than the Allies could bomb them. It could not rebuild 3 years of flight training in 3 months, no matter how many airframes came off the line. This is the part of the doctrine's failure that the original bomber mafia theory never accounted for at all. The industrial web theory assumed that destroying factories won wars. What actually broke the Luftwaffe was destroying the men who flew what the factories built, and that damage, unlike a bombed-out assembly line, could not be repaired by moving production underground. The monthly attrition figures for Luftwaffe fighter pilots through the first half of 1944 tell the real story of what Doolittle's order actually accomplished. In January, 30.3% of German single-engine fighters were written off, along with 16.9% of their pilots. In February, the month of Big Week, that rose to 33.8% of aircraft and 17.9% of pilots. In March, it jumped to 56.4% of fighters lost and 21.7% of pilots, the highest single-month loss rate of the entire war to that point. By May, monthly pilot losses reached roughly 25%, meaning that in a single month, the Luftwaffe was losing a quarter of its entire fighter pilot force. Between January and June of 1944, 2,262 German fighter pilots were killed out of an average operational strength of only around 2,283 pilots at any given time. Read that again. Germany was losing, in raw numbers, close to its entire average fighter pilot force every 6 months, and it could not train replacements fast enough to keep pace. The month after Big Week produced the single battle that most historians treat as the true hinge point, even more than Big Week itself. On March 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force sent roughly 730 bombers, escorted by around 800 fighters, to attack Berlin directly for the first time in a major daylight raid. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them in force. The 8th lost 69 B-17s that day, with the 100th bomb group alone losing 15 aircraft, a toll that cemented its grim nickname, the Bloody 100th. But German losses that day and in the days around it ran to roughly 160 aircraft. And John Correll's account of the campaign notes that the March Berlin battles cost the Luftwaffe's fighter chief, Adolf Galland, roughly 20% of his experienced pilots in that single month alone. This is the part I think deserves the emphasis. American bomber losses in March 1944 were real and painful. German losses that same month were structurally fatal, because Germany was fighting a war of attrition it could no longer win. It is worth naming exactly what American fighter pilots were fighting during these months, because this audience will want the specifics. The core of Luftwaffe fighter strength defending the Reich was the Messerschmitt 109, in its G model by this stage of the war, a fast, nimble interceptor that had been the backbone of German fighter forces since the Battle of Britain, alongside the newer Focke-Wulf 190, a radial-engined fighter that traded some high-altitude performance for brutal firepower and toughness at the altitudes bomber formations actually flew. Some Focke-Wulf units by early 1944 were flying specialized heavy fighter variants carrying underwing rocket tubes designed specifically to break up bomber formations from outside the range of their defensive guns before conventional fighters closed in for the kill. Against the P-51B, still armed with only 4 50-caliber machine guns compared to the 6 carried by later D models, German pilots and well-flown Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs remained genuinely dangerous adversaries throughout this period. The difference by the spring of 1944 was not that German airplanes had gotten worse, it was that the men flying them increasingly had not, because the pilots with the experience to fly those airplanes well were dying faster than German flight schools, starved of fuel for training flights, could produce replacements. Gave his superiors numbers that read almost like a confession. He reported that, in the previous 10 operations alone, the Luftwaffe had lost 500 aircraft and 400 pilots. He reported that in the previous 4 months, roughly 1,000 pilots had been killed. He told his superiors that Allied fighters now outnumbered his own by somewhere between 6-1 and 8-1, and that the standard of Allied fighter pilot training was, in his own words, astonishingly high. Gallen's own summary of the crisis is worth quoting almost in full, because it is as close as you will get to the enemy's own verdict on Doolittle's decision. He wrote that between January and April, German daytime fighters had lost over 1,000 pilots, including some of their best squadron, group, and wing commanders, and that each Allied incursion was now costing the Luftwaffe roughly 50 aircrew. "The time has come," he wrote, "when our weapon is in sight of collapse." The historian Richard Overy later summarized the arithmetic behind Gallen's despair. By early 1944, Overy wrote, the German fighter force was managing an average net gain of only 26 new pilots per month, an addition so small it could not begin to offset the losses being inflicted on it. Overy called what remained of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm a brittle shield. It is worth stopping here and putting the before and after side by side, because the contrast is the entire argument of this video in miniature. In the last 5 months of 1943, under the old doctrine, the 8th Air Force's average monthly heavy bomber loss rate ran at 5.1% per mission, a rate that, projected across a full combat tour, meant most crews were mathematically unlikely to survive. In 1944, under the new doctrine, that average monthly loss rate fell to 1.9%. Before the order, American fighters flew perhaps 60 to 80 miles into Germany before their fuel forced them to turn for home, leaving the deepest, most dangerous legs of every mission completely unescorted. After the order, with the Mustang's range, fighters were covering bombers to Berlin and back, a round trip of well over 1,000 miles. Before the order, a bomber crew's odds over Schweinfurt were roughly 1 in 5 that their own aircraft would not make it home from that single mission. After Big Week in the following spring, missions into the heart of Germany were returning 93% or more of the attacking force intact. The airplanes did not get meaningfully faster. The bombs did not get meaningfully bigger. What changed the odds was permission for the fighters to stop babysitting and start hunting. The payoff to all of this arrived on June 6, 1944, the day of the Normandy invasion, and it is the cleanest single proof that Doolittle's order had worked exactly as intended. On D-Day itself, the Allies flew roughly 14,674 combat sorties over the invasion beaches. The Luftwaffe, which 2 years earlier had ruled the skies over occupied Europe, managed to contribute fewer than 100 sorties in defense of the beaches all day, with a total of only around 319 Luftwaffe sorties flown that entire day across the whole theater. John Carell's research puts the number of German fighters that actually made it over the beaches on D-Day at roughly 70, with about 175 more flying that night, to no significant effect. Fewer than 4 years after German air power had broken France in 6 weeks, it could barely put a squadron over the most important amphibious invasion in history. Ira Eaker, the General Doolittle had replaced, was by then commanding air forces in the Mediterranean, watching the invasion he had helped prepare for unfold from a distance. When word reached him that the Luftwaffe had failed to show up over the beaches in any real strength, He later called it his greatest personal satisfaction of the entire war. I find that a genuinely poignant detail. The man who had been eased out of the main command, in part because he could not or would not break with the doctrine he had built his career defending, still felt real personal joy watching the Air Force he had once commanded finally deliver the air superiority everyone had promised in 1942, and nobody had actually achieved until Doolittle changed the rules. Some of the technical detail underneath all of this is worth slowing down for, because your channel's audience will notice if it is missing, and honestly, it is the part of the story I find most satisfying. The P-51B Mustang carried 184 gallons of fuel internally in its wings. Partway through production, North American added a fuselage tank behind the pilot that raised total internal capacity to 269 gallons, though pilots had to burn that rear tank down first, because flying with it full created dangerous handling problems, shifting the aircraft's center of gravity too far aft for safe maneuvering. Add two 75-gallon drop tanks and total fuel capacity reached 419 gallons. Later in the year, with larger 110-gallon drop tanks, that figure climbed to 489 gallons, giving later Mustangs a combat radius approaching 850 miles. Compare that to the P-47D Thunderbolt of the same period, which carried 305 gallons internally, roughly 250 miles, further short of the Mustang's initial edge before you even add drop tanks, and mounted 850 caliber machine guns against the Mustang's 4. The Thunderbolt was tougher, better armed, and arguably a better close and dogfighter at lower altitudes, but it simply could not go the distance, and distance was the entire problem Doolittle needed solved. In its first 55 days of combat with the 8th Air Force, the P-51B claimed 13.1 enemy aircraft per 100 sorties flown, compared to 4.3 for the twin-engined P-38 Lightning and just 2.7 for the P-47. The numbers made the case for the Mustang more completely than any argument in a headquarters meeting ever could. The Lightning deserves a fair word here too, because it is often overlooked in this particular story. On paper, the P-38 had range enough to reach deep into Germany, and it had proven itself devastatingly effective in the Mediterranean and the Pacific. Over the freezing high altitudes of northern Europe, though, its twin Allison engines suffered persistent reliability problems, and pilots found the cockpit heating system inadequate at the altitudes bomber formations typically flew, leaving some Lightning pilots too cold to fight effectively by the time they reached the target area. It was a capable airplane, fighting the wrong climate, and it is a reminder that even good hardware can fail for reasons that have nothing to do with its basic design. The bombers themselves were also in transition during this same period, and getting the aircraft right matters to an audience that has read the books and studied the airframes. At the start of 1944, the 8th Air Force was still flying a mix of the B-17F, the model that had gone to Schweinfurt in October, and the newer B-17G, which added a Bendix-built chin turret directly under the nose to fix a defensive gap German fighters had learned to exploit by attacking head-on. The chin turret had actually first appeared on the final 86 Douglas-built B-17Fs before becoming standard equipment on every G model that followed. And by January of 1944, factories had also stopped applying olive-drab camouflage paint, sending bombers into combat in bare natural metal finish to save weight and production time. Eventually, more than 8,680 B-17Gs would roll off the lines at Boeing, Douglas, and Vega combined. Alongside the Fortresses, the 8th also flew the B-24 Liberator in growing numbers, though the force remained predominantly a B-17 command throughout this period, and Doolittle himself, by most accounts, preferred the Fortress and tried without success to convert some of his Liberator groups over to it. Getting these small details right is not pedantry. For an audience that includes men who worked the flight line or flew these airplanes themselves, it is the difference between a channel they trust and one they do not. The system's response to being proven wrong tells you almost everything you need to know about how institutions actually behave when their founding theory collapses. Doolittle's order was, by any honest reading, a repudiation of a decade of Air Corps doctrine. And yet nobody at the Air Corps Tactical School was ever formally held accountable for building a bombing theory that assumed away the single biggest reason it would eventually fail. Haywood Hansell, one of the doctrine's original architects, did not simply watch it get overturned in Europe and quietly accept the verdict. He went on to command the 21st Bomber Command in the Pacific, starting in November of 1944, flying B-29s against Japan, and he applied the exact same high-altitude precision bombing theory that had just failed against Germany, It failed again, for many of the same reasons, jet stream winds and industrial dispersal chief among them, and Hansel was relieved of command by Curtis LeMay in January of 1945, less than a year after Big Week had already demonstrated the limits of the doctrine he still believed in. Years later, Hansel wrote a book defending the tactical school's original theory called The Air Plan That Defeated Hitler, published in the 1970s. One reviewer at the time described him as too close to his own subject to be objective, comparing him to a parent who refuses to believe his own baby might be ugly. I think that image is exactly right, and I think it is the most honest way to describe what happened to an entire generation of bomber mafia officers. They had built something they believed in completely. They had staked their careers and their reputations on it, and even overwhelming combat evidence was not enough to make some of them let it go. The post-war record backs up that verdict from an unexpected direction. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, the government's own exhaustive post-war study of what the bombing campaign had actually accomplished, concluded that air superiority had to come before precision. Bombing could deliver anything close to its promised effect, not the other way around, directly contradicting the sequence the bomber mafia's original theory had assumed. The survey's economists and analysts, working through German records after the surrender, found that the bombing campaign's real strategic payoff came overwhelmingly in the months after the Luftwaffe had already been broken as a fighting force, not before. In other words, the government's own post-war accountants confirmed exactly what Doolittle had staked his career on in January of 1944. You cannot bomb your way to victory while the enemy still owns the sky above the target, and then watch those same people quietly take credit. Once someone else fixes the problem they refuse to see, you already understand this part of the air war better than most of the men who planned it did. The pattern is older than any of us, and it usually does not get this many people killed, but it is the same pattern. I want to give Ira Eaker his full due here too, because an honest assessment cuts both ways, and this channel does not do hit jobs. Eaker was not a coward, and he was not a fool. He had built the 8th Air Force almost from nothing in 1942. He had defended it through its darkest year, and by his own instincts, he had pushed for drop tanks to extend his fighter's range, even before the Mustang made that argument moot. His mistake, if you want to call it that, was staying loyal to a doctrine that the men above him, and the men who trained under him, had all been taught to believe was sound. He inherited a theory. He did not invent it. And when the evidence at Schweinfurt said the theory was broken, Eaker's answer was to keep flying the same doctrine more carefully, rather than to throw the doctrine out entirely. Doolittle, arriving from outside that institutional lineage, with no personal investment in defending the tactical school's legacy, was free to throw it out. I think that is the real lesson buried in this story, and it is one your audience will recognize from their own careers. Sometimes the person best positioned to fix a broken system is not the most experienced person in the room. It is the person with the least personal stake in defending how things have always been done. I also think it is worth resisting the temptation to make this a clean story about one villain and one hero, because the actual historical record will not let you. The Bomber Mafia were not cynics protecting their own careers. They were officers who had genuinely convinced themselves their theory was sound, and conviction of that depth is much harder to dislodge with evidence than simple dishonesty would be. A dishonest man can be shown a balance sheet and change his mind once the lie stops paying. A true believer treats the same balance sheet as an obstacle to be explained away, and Hansel's post-war defense of the doctrine he had helped build shows exactly how long that kind of conviction can survive contact with the facts. That, more than any single sign on a wall, is the pattern I think this channel exists to expose. Not villainy, certainty that outlived its evidence. So what actually changed the outcome of the air war over Europe? Not a single new bomb type, not a dramatic new bombing theory replacing the old one. The actual mechanism was almost mundane by comparison, which I think is part of why it does not get the dramatic treatment in most documentaries. One general took down a sign, wrote a new one, and told his fighter pilots that their job was no longer to babysit the bombers, but to go find and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. That decision, combined with an airplane that finally had the legs to make it possible, turned a war of bomber attrition, which America was slowly losing in the fall of 1943, into a war of pilot attrition, which Germany could never win. Between January and June of 1944, Germany lost roughly 2,262 fighter pilots it could not adequately replace. By the time the Allies landed in Normandy, the Luftwaffe that had once ruled the skies over Poland, France, and Britain could put fewer than 100 fighters over the most important battle of the war. The doctrine that said bombers would always get through had been proven wrong at Schweinfurt. at a cost of thousands of American lives. The fix, when it finally came from a man the bomber mafia had never trained, applying an airplane the bomber mafia had never wanted, and enforcing a doctrine the bomber mafia had spent a decade insisting the Air Corps did not need. None of this required a new invention. Every piece of it, the airplane, the range, the willingness to break with 2 years of official policy, existed in England before Doolittle ever walked into Kepner's headquarters. What had been missing was a commander willing to act on all of it at once, in writing, over the objections of men senior to him in institutional standing, if not in rank. I think that is ultimately the most useful thing this story can teach anyone, watching it, who has ever sat inside an organization that was doing something the wrong way for reasons nobody wanted to examine too closely. The fix is rarely a secret. It is usually sitting in a memo somebody already wrote, or a tactic some captain already tried without permission. What is missing is someone with enough authority, and little enough to lose, willing to sign their name to it. Doolittle would go on to call the decision the most important of his war. I think the historical record backs him up completely, and I also think it is worth remembering exactly what it cost to get there, because that cost is the reason his order mattered as much as it did. If your father or grandfather flew with the 8th Air Force in 1943 or 1944, whether in a bomber crew or a fighter squadron, I would like to hear about it. Those stories matter. Drop them in the comments. That's the story. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.